Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and beyond. And today's guest is here to talk to us about phenomena.
I think a phenomenon, or the way we've talked about it, is events that happen in the world. I think it's important that they be these contextualized events that happen in the world, because it keeps us from creating kind of posterized textbook representations that might just come straight from the textbook. Trying to make sense of phenomenon, it activates you employing those different practices as ways to refine the explanation that you're working on with peers.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
And we're back with another podcast and some good NGSS talk today.
Well, we have talked a little bit about wanting to do a little segment on using phenomena. And I've seen this more and more. And so it's really been fascinating to watch that unfold throughout the life of the podcast.
For sure. And that's what our guest today is working on also, as a matter of, for teachers going into the classroom, spends a lot of time working with pre-service teachers.
That part of the conversation gave me hope, Dale. I think we've all felt a little bit beaten down about the future of education, and particularly science education, in the sense that, we don't have some rigorous testing in the elementary level for science education necessarily.
Yeah.
We have, we see some of those practices just not happening in the lower levels. And then it's just, in any case, this conversation with Todd starts off talking about how teacher preparation has changed, and it really gave me hope for our future.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Let's meet our guest, Dr. Todd Campbell. Here he is now.
My name is Todd Campbell. I'm a professor of science education at the University of Connecticut. I'm also a department head. I'll stick with the professor of science education because I think that's what's most relevant. I work with pre-service science teachers in our secondary education program at the University of Connecticut. And then I also do a lot of work with in-service teachers as part of NSF-funded projects or professional development projects.
How's the state of pre-service teachers right now? Do we have a good supply?
It feels like the supply is decreasing.
Yeah.
But I'm just generalizing.
You got supply chain shortages too?
Yeah, I'm dangerously generalizing. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have a sense of that. I know these are generalizations, but we have a sense of that too. Just the general ability to fill teaching jobs and things like that seems to be much more difficult than it used to be.
Yeah. I think it's good on the job market where the students our students are going to get jobs. We have districts calling after the school starts in the fall.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
I wonder if some of the ways teachers were treated during the pandemic is also going to come back and bite us. Has probably already, but we'll continue to do that.
Well, I think during the pandemic, it wasn't just teaching, but a lot of professions had their employees kind of just self-evaluating and re-looking at their lives and kind of just saying, you know what, I'm going to try this.
Yeah.
I also think there's a point where we've had, like you said, teaching has gotten to a point where people have often been curious about what life is like outside the classroom. And, this gave them the shove out the door that they may have needed to explore those options.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. I also think of the asking teachers to teach in person and online concurrently. I think that just may have been too much for too many.
Sure.
Right.
I wondered if we were going to see some, and time will tell, if we were going to see some new things in teaching because of this, ways to kind of do things differently instead of just snapping back to the way we are. I'm not sure what's going to happen yet.
Yeah. I know, like for my university classes with pre-service teachers, like we have at times shifted more readily to online. If there was a session that we thought we could just do that, it would be more convenient. And then just generally my job as department head, we continue to have all our meetings online. So there's things we picked up that we really appreciated and we're going to keep doing.
For sure.
Right. And your world has probably changed quite a bit in terms of science education preparation in the last 10 years with new standards too, is my guess.
Yes, in very positive ways, I would suggest.
Oh, yeah? Well, I mean, I would hope that's the case. I would hate to see, it's been horrible. But what can you tell us about that? How has it changed, and why is it great?
Yeah, I think it's changed because of our shift in NGSS. I know we're talking about phenomenon today, but I think that's central to it. So that's one thing I'll mention. The trying our best to create representations of science activity within classrooms. So trying our best to, if science is the construction and critique of explanations of things that happen in the world, that's what we want our students to get opportunities to do in classrooms. And because we prioritize that instead of what felt like playing school.
Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3.
Yeah, I feel like that is this exciting thing, but I'd also throw on top of that is there's people who've done some tremendous work. We use the ambitious science teaching high leverage practices in our pre-service teacher education, and they like the access to high quality resources to support teaching and learning. I think is that's where 10 or 15 years ago I was struggling as a methods instructor to move beyond just talking about theoretical reasons for doing things in classrooms to having some resources to give students or prospective teachers that kind of learner had experiences that would model the things we would ask them to do, and then we do like approximations of practice where they pick up some high quality materials and they automatically are ready to engage students to make sense of something that's curious in the world.
Well, that's interesting. I want to just unpack that for a second, because we often think about teaching in general as nothing can really prepare you for the classroom except for the classroom itself. And student teaching is a pivotal moment in realizing I can do this as a teacher or not. But what you're saying is you feel like you have some better ways to prepare students even before they get into the classroom.
I would say I think we do. I think those opportunities, like in our class, we do lots of rehearsals. So students will teach a whole class period of 40 minutes. We'll set it up as mock, and their peers will be students. So it's a little bit different, but they'll spend the whole class eliciting students' initial ideas about a phenomenon. Do some timeouts and pauses and say we'll question ourselves and problematize things that happen, especially if the teacher's talking too much. And then we'll try it again, or we'll ask somebody else in the class to step up and give it a try. And so I think that only builds confidence in people, in the pre-service teachers before they go out into the classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's funny sometimes that working with teachers ourselves, sometimes teachers who are always in front of students all the time have the hardest time actually stepping in front of their peers. And that peer practice is huge. It's a good way to break the ice. It's a good way to get feedback from each other and just kind of overcome some of those mental or emotional obstacles that you may have. And I still don't understand it sometimes when a teacher can do that in front of the classroom, but they struggle so much in front of their peers.
Yeah, I think the practice-based model of teacher education, where maybe you just frame it as like we're just together trying to hone our practice. We're trying to figure out what our practice is and how to make it better. And instead of you're on the stage and we're going to judge you about whether you're doing it right or wrong. Instead, it's these are some strategies people found that work. Let's try them out, and then let's even suggest some ways we can make them better as we go.
It's not like an audition where there's cuts, right?
Yeah, no. Although we do, it's really cool. We do some videoing of their teaching when they're doing it, peer teaching in classrooms or in our
Sure.
methods class, and then they go home and they analyze it. They transcribe a portion of it. They look at the ratio of teacher to student talk, and even with that, there's no right or wrong. They just come back and talk about, like, is this the proportion of talk you want from a teacher yourself as the teacher in the classroom? If so, what is it about this particular part of the lesson that might make it okay if the teacher talks a little bit more, or not okay?
I remember doing a very similar activity as a pre-service teacher myself, the same thing. Recording, it was on VHS back then, recording and then going home, and you had to note. It was basically charting the talking and everything like that.
That's one thing the pandemic gave us, is the comfort to record ourselves. I think I'm hoping that does stick with us for not only for practice, but for communicating beyond the classroom as well.
Yeah, definitely.
You talked about this next generation science standards earlier, and the challenging and critiquing science, which sounds like a lot of talking, discussing, writing that happens in a science class, and possibly more than the people may expect. Maybe your public, your parents would expect a science class to be all about the experiments and, what did you cook up today? Yet there's this aspect of science that involves a lot of pondering, discussing, and then going to the lab and then coming back and those kinds of things. Do you think what I'm describing is accurate? And if so, is there possibly some work to be done there with the public?
That's a great question. I think what you've described is accurate. Like, I think in the early 1996 National Science Ed Standards, like, there was the emphasis on inquiry, but it felt like it was strictly almost restricted to inquiry or to scientific investigations in laboratories, and now it feels like we realize the social negotiation that happens around ideas and how important that is.
Yeah.
And how iterating ideas over time and being able to show the progression of your ideas connected to evidence you might have collected, and the logical coherence between the evidence you collect and the claims you're trying to make, like, all that's really complex. And I try to think about, what might I show a parent of a student I have in a classroom, and I don't teach K-12, so I'm conjecturing, but what might I show them that would demonstrate, like, what we really do in class? And I think about, like, an initial model at the beginning of a unit where they're trying to explain something that happens in the world, and then over time we support them with putting ideas on the table that they might pick up, and they'd show up in their models. And then, so if I could show a parent that initial model and that final model, and if there was an evidence-based explanation that went alongside that model, I feel like that's a powerful artifact of learning from the classroom.
And that model doesn't have to be styrofoam and clay and pipe cleaners. That model is not going to be that kind of model.
Right. And that's a big distinction.
So then if we think that the public doesn't necessarily understand science, is that because they haven't had updated science standards to kind of understand that framework in which science should be taught now?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I've spent enough time thinking about the public's understanding of science as much as I've been focused on, supporting teachers and supporting students in classrooms. And I know other people have, and gosh, I just haven't spent enough time thinking about, like, what would it take to turn toward the public and support them and recognize it's critically important now, for sure, given what's happened with vaccinations and the pandemic. And but I don't know, maybe my naive and blindered been that the students help teach the parents.
It's on my mind as we, improve schools, expand schools, build new schools, think about, what will this school need? What are we looking for in a teacher? Just the general feedback to parents too. If a parent is expecting it to be one way, and then, maybe saying like, why are they writing so much in science class or something like that. That's an understanding that may not support what the teacher's doing, and in some cases could wear that practice away because of the resistance.
Right. Yeah. That it definitely is a concern of, I do think like it's valuable to think about, how can we communicate to parents to let them know what we're prioritizing and why and what we're legitimating, and then also doing that kind of work with our principals or administrators who have some evaluatory role.
Yeah, absolutely. And that it's okay to not be what the parents learned when they went through school. That is often the common thread of, I went through high school, so I know how it should work. And, if it was good enough for me, this is good enough for them. But being able to show the public that it can be better.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. You mentioned, obviously, that the framework and how you teach and prepare science teachers has changed tremendously with the adoption of NGSS, and you said you teased a little bit about how phenomena is kind of a core of that. So let's drill into that. What is a phenomenon, or what are phenomena, and why are they important in teaching science?
Another great question. I think a phenomenon, or the way we've talked about it, and we use other people's resources to help our own pre-service teachers select phenomenon that might anchor a unit, is like events that happen in the world. I think it's important that they be these contextualized events that happen in the world, because it keeps us from trying from creating kind of posterized textbook representations that might just come straight from a textbook. Instead, it's something that's complex, that's takes multiple ideas connected together with evidence that allow us to use practice. Like, I love practices as knowledge production practices. So like they're those things that help us work at knowing. So if you're trying to make sense of phenomenon, it activates you employing those different practices as ways to refine the explanation that you're working on with peers.
Do you have an example or examples that compare the two? One that isn't the textbooky one. This versus that kind of scenario that would kind of illustrate that.
I'm thinking so like typically, if you'd ask students to describe what happens with a volcano, that might just lead to them, recreating something they may have seen in a textbook. But I think there was a great lesson that one of my colleagues at University of Northern Arizona created, where it was a seamount, axial seamount right off the coast of Portland, I believe. And it was an actual, what's happened at this site that's caused the creation of the seamount. And so, students had to look at different data sets, and it was very specific to that area. So the data sets would give them data to make claims about whether the plates were spreading apart or converging. And so they could really talk about something specific that may not be identical to another location, but it was the nuance that, positioned them to use practices and disciplinary ideas together to work together to convince each other. And then part of what I love about phenomenon and that working at knowing is you really don't understand or know what practices are and what advantage they might give you unless you are positioned in some level of uncertainty. So without uncertainty, it may not really be a practice. And so if you've introduced something to students, an example we were looking at in methods class yesterday was a dragster, one of the thin rail cars that has the big wheels on the back, and they run it through the water and they start spinning the wheels quickly in the water, and it immediately you could see about 10 inches of tire expand all around that
I love
car.
That.
And so to say what's going on there, what would have caused that, and what's really important and not, we just start applying what we think is useful, and we get rid of it if it's not, and we look for more evidence if we think we need to stay with an idea.
So it's really kind of making time for students to question the world.
Yeah, yeah, and giving them, I guess, positioning them on the edge, so that there is that uncertainty that would make it worthwhile engaging in and staying with it. Maybe it has to get inside their head like it does ours before they're going to stay with it.
Which is, I think, a major shift from maybe the way that we were taught science, is that there wasn't a lot of uncertainty. I mean, there was things unknown, but the things that were known were pretty concrete. That there's questions at the end of the chapter that address these concepts. But the uncertainty is what is hooking the kids into learning and engaging deeper.
Yeah, and it's always like, I feel like we should take advantage of what people learned before us, but we shouldn't let it be what we get as a representation of what science is. So like taking the particulate nature of matter and introducing that to students instead of asking them to reinvent something that took a long time. We don't need to do that, but we should, as we introduce or when we introduce it, we should position them to use it and see how valuable it is at explaining something they wouldn't have been able to explain without those ideas.
When I was as a physics teacher, I was taught to use discrepant events often to lead a unit or lead that discussion. That was often my go-to tool, I think, for physics. Is that a subcategory of phenomena? Is that just one type of it, or not, or is it not at all?
I'm sharing my ideas. I don't want to say this is right or wrong. I think it does. I think it, for me, what I knew about discrepant events were like it did elicit it captivated students. Many times when I was introduced to it, it was followed by the teacher explaining it, which is we want teachers to introduce ideas, not explanations, and we want students to be working on the explanations. And so like maybe the discrepant events are what we're still using as phenomena, as long as they're complex and it's multiple fine-grained ideas that need to come together, then it is it's a phenomenon that could sustain study over a multiple days in a unit. But if it's, something that's a really good representation of one idea, then maybe it's not. And maybe some of the discrepant events probably were some of both of those, right? They could probably be used today as an anchoring event for a unit, or some of them may have been, once students said one idea, they may have gotten close to the idea that really mattered to explain what that discrepant event was.
Mm-hmm. We used to, we'd introduce those, and it was always, I didn't do the explaining of it, but you'd always try to come up with, okay, what experiments can we do? What questions can we ask? To try to guide them toward, the what it is, and get them there. But man, when it didn't happen, it was so painful, because if you had a class that was stuck, and you just feel like, to me, that was one of the biggest feelings of a failure as a teacher, when I had to we're running out of time and I don't know where to, where to go here I was running out of prompts to get, to get them to the concept that I was hoping the lesson did. So it was retooled for the next year,
Yeah. And I still think that probably happens or will happen quite a bit with NGSS. Is like, there are times where I've done it where, as the teacher, I step in too quickly with another idea, or I'm too anxious. I'm not willing to step back enough, or I'm fearful that I haven't given enough support that my students have within their reach, something that's going to help them. So I still think like that's probably the most complex and the area of tension that we need to keep developing practices around, that would, so what's a teacher to do when they get in that moment where the whole class struggling and potentially frustrated and maybe ready to give up? Like what's a good productive step a teacher could take at that point?
And the students are suspicious too, because they're not necessarily used to this practice in other courses or their history. At least some of the students' experiences I had. And so I remember times where it's just like, just tell us, and like I can just picture the days where I let the bell ring and let it just stew overnight.
Yeah.
And it's so rewarding the next day when you had kids coming in and they're like, all right, I started thinking about this, or I started talking to my family or something like that. And those are the best situations. But there's pressure the other way too sometimes to just call uncle.
Yeah. And I think like trying to think through like how much support do we want, how much support should we give them, and then not stepping in. Like I feel like students are trained to figure us out, and so once we step in too quickly, they're ready to do that again. And I also think about how like school science is really different than what scientists do, in that like the teacher is the one standing in the classroom and planning this lesson and has in their head what a potentially productive explanation at the end is going to be. And so it's a lot, that's quite different than what scientists would do, where they're really, I guess it all depends on how we as a teacher continually frame our instruction and our role with the students in the classroom.
Sure.
Todd, when you're using phenomenon like this, and let's use the seamount example, would this be something that a teacher develops a unit for, and they come back to this every year around the same time, or is this a dynamic process that does it change? Are students finding the phenomena that they want to investigate?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So a couple of things are going through my head is, one is like just the power of high quality curriculum. So I know there's, if there's ways that teachers don't have to create, may not have the time. If there's ways that teachers can be supported with high quality curriculum as a start, and maybe they figure out like the idea is that it would be place based and local. So is there something about this, because the knowledge pieces in the middle that I'm going to put on the table are also probably applicable to similar phenomenon that might be more local. And so are there more local phenomenon that I could engage my students in that really matter and maybe have social implications that I want to even engage them in as well? The thing I think everybody's getting to around partially the pandemic probably helped us with this is that, when we started out, which was a great start, we looked at phenomena, but they're kind of sanitized, in that they're taken out of the world and we look at them and try to explain them. And then when we have something like disproportionate impact of COVID on ethnic and racial minority groups, like that's a social issue that science has a role in helping explain, but science also and students could play a role in advocating for social transformation. And so like those for me are the most powerful, and where we're probably going with NGSS 2.0 is we need to figure out ways that we don't take the phenomena out of the world and sit there and analyze them, but we try to still recognize the power of rallying ideas and evidences to explain stuff, but in the service of something bigger and potentially more just.
I think when you mention that, like the local time and place of phenomena, it sparks events like weather and geology, and maybe biodiversity. Whatever you have on the Southwest is majorly different than what you have on the East Coast, for instance, and in the Midwest as well. Do we see that happening in those extremes, or is chemistry more of a universal, or I guess what?
Great question again. I wonder, like, I think we have to get there, and we have to give ourselves time and grace to get there to where we're aiming for. But like it feels to me like chemistry and every other discipline that's been held up as rigorous, and this is how you need to teach it. Like it's not that different. Like it needs to be applied if it's going to have meaning, especially in students' lives, and maybe even if they're going to really learn it. So trying to find those applications in chemistry that matter too, I think would be really important. I'll give an example of, like, in Connecticut, the state legislation has mandated K through 8's climate change curriculum be assembled, and that climate change be a part of K through 8 science education. And so the state's putting together resources, but with, limited time to get those in place before the law goes into effect. And next year, teachers are asked to do that. And so what we're trying to do is, like, we're reaching out, and there's places like Washington State that have been working on this for 4 or 5 years, but much of their resources are local, which is exactly what they should be. But it's hard for another state to pick up, and
those are not easily transportable.
Yeah. And so ideally, we really want our climate education to be focused on things that matter locally, but I'm sure some of those extend globally, and all of them do. But, the students can find that local connection.
Mm-hmm.
So we have, you mentioned, of course, like thinking about NGSS 2.0, but we have states, we have communities that haven't even dabbled too much in NGSS 1.0 or 0.9 or whatever the case may be. They haven't really done much work in the framework or in the actual standards. Now, is Phenomena a good point for them to start? Is that where do you begin if you don't have those resources at hand?
I really like, I don't know if you're familiar, I suspect you are, the STEM teaching tools. Bill Pinuel's work at University of Washington, UC Boulder, STEM teaching tools. If you Google it, it'll come up. They have several tools there, but one of them was early on, they were using curriculum adaptation. And I really appreciated that with, veteran teachers. Like, what it did is it would ask teachers to bring in a unit and tell us what activities are part of that unit. And then let's identify where those ideas and activities would really make sense to explain something. Let's identify some anchoring phenomenon. And then after we identify it, let's figure out which one of those activities are still necessary to explain it. And so they were trying to use what teachers already had and had expertise in teaching to orient it toward a phenomenon. And so I really appreciated that. Like, I think they could start from their existing curriculum, but then also, like you said, prioritize, like, it's got to be about explaining the world, or it's got to be some societally important question that students are going after. The pursuit matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sometimes gets lost when we have school boards adopting the curriculum, not necessarily on a fault of their own, but you tend to think of the science standards as these physical units. You must understand speed. You must understand, the atomic nature of the elements and all those things that we think of as, I guess, those classical chapters in science learning.
That's where it comes back to the public understanding what's happening in a science class, because you're absolutely right. There's all these local decisions all over the nation.
Yeah. And so, like, that's what I think makes science teaching really exciting. Like it's never been solved. It won't be solved. We'll keep working to improve it. And now, like, even with NGSS, which I agree, I think we've made leaps and bounds in certain places, and certain places haven't picked up on it. But it feels like we're a lot better off than we were 8-10 years ago, and now we got somewhere to go. We're figuring out, like, something like the pandemic happens that shows us, there's ways we can move past, we can take what we've learned and we can build on that.
What about when a student gets behind? Maybe it's illness, maybe they're just not good at organization, time, those kinds of things. Does some of the things that we've just discussed run into a wall here when a student is maybe, weeks and weeks behind?
Oh, I would say yes.
And how do we get? What do we do? I mean, in that situation, I'm thinking of specific cases where a kid's got a stack of work that they either put off or couldn't do at a period of time. I mean, if you don't have your class to go through that anymore with, then what?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great, like I think about it in comparison, like what would they do if we were traversing traditional curriculum? They'd sit down behind a stack of stuff and read through it, and it wouldn't be that high quality in that case either. In our case, where we have, we've worked to explain something, I think maybe then I would still try to position them to explain things and try my best to use the resources I use with students on a one-on-one as a chance to over time help them refine their explanation. But I also could rely on students in my class to be a support if they've already moved into it or moved past where that student's at. I don't think either one of those things I described is ideal. But when someone misses a month or 2 months, like I don't know that there's a silver bullet to catch someone up. And maybe that's the nature of, that's why we do what we do.
Well, yeah, at some point the teen and their parents might be like, okay, we're not in it to learn it anymore. We're in it to pass, to get through it. That shift there can just be damaging to the whole goal.
Right. Like we want I think Cindy Passmore does a great job of talking about how important framing is. Like when it turns from being, we're trying to figure it out to we just got to get this done. We're playing school. That's a different thing. And you're really not going to be engaging in practices if you're just playing school, I don't think.
So do you lean, I guess really what I'm saying is, can NGSS work? Can it work well in those situations? A student is behind with weeks of science work. Can it be done?
I don't know the answer to that. Like I would say like
because I feel like we're gonna fall back on, all right, well, why don't you just show me that this is the stuff you know?
Yeah, and then we know that's not true. That's not learning. It's not deep learning. And so like I try to stick into myself in my head. I try to think like, what is science? What is learning? What does learning science mean? And if that has to be the guide. So even if I'm trying to work with a student that's missed multiple weeks, I still gotta stay true to what science is. It's construction and critique. So you gotta engage in that struggle of moving forward and stepping back and moving forward with ideas. But over time, that's what really helps students learn through application or applying ideas, knowledge production, knowledge in use. And so that's, I got to stay true to that, because if I say, well, I just can't move back to that traditional model, even when it seems like that's more efficient, because I know efficiency wasn't enough previously, so it shouldn't be enough in this situation.
Yeah, it just feels like a punch card, basically. Like, okay, we put our time in, but that seat time isn't the goal. And once we realize that, then what are we doing here? I almost lean towards cut your losses and bring that kid into the fold at the moment, and try to go from there if possible. It's far more valuable.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the part about not only are we wanting them to learn science, we want them to identify with, become interested in, see themselves connected to and capable of. And so I would rather cut losses like you suggested and get them engaged with peers and finding success than stuck behind a stack of something that's just going to put them farther and farther behind.
And make them hate it.
Yep.
Well, and I'm thinking in the back of my head too, not just having students absent, but teachers absent, and how do you have a competent sub execute something like this? And I'm not looking for an answer. I know that's more challenging. We're almost out of time, but
great. If we weren't out of time, I would be all over that one.
Before we let you go, though, I'd like to get your ideas of how your students have adapted to these changes in science education and their successes there, and have they experienced I guess, bringing along a veteran into changing how they do science education.
Yeah, I couldn't be more inspired by the students that I work with in the pre-service teacher education program, and I stay connected to them as they believe the program. I try to get students in their classrooms, hosting their clinicals, and when it's time, hosting their student teaching. I see them recognizing the power of this, really engaging in science in a more authentic way. And then I also see, and our program has after student teaching, they're with us another year as a master's year, and they do an internship. And typically that's connected to the classroom, but it's also focused on leadership and teacher leadership. So sometimes they show up in departments and they help them figure out like what's a scope and sequence across biology that would allow students to engage in phenomenon in coherent ways across a year. So like they do get to support in-service teachers with professional learning and developing and refining curriculum that'll help them do this, and they work beside them. And so I couldn't be more, I think, some of the teachers I know that are 2-3 years out are probably way better teachers than I am when it comes to K-12 education. Like I'm amazed. I follow them on Twitter. I'm amazed at the things they're doing with their students, negotiating in their show, able to show it over time, getting more sophisticated.
Well, that's heartwarming. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Todd, thank you for talking to us about science teacher preparation and how it's changed, especially in using phenomena and understanding the world around us, and how students might understand science better for that.
Great. I've enjoyed visiting with you, so thanks for having me.
Same here. Thanks much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.